They called her Grandma Dusty behind her back, a cruel little joke that echoed in the sterile halls of Metropolitan Trauma Center. Dr. Preston Sterling, the Golden Boy Chief of Surgery, had actually started a betting pool in the residence lounge. A crisp $100 bill said Sarah Miller, the new 50-something floor nurse with the quiet voice and the hands that held a faint, rhythmic tremor, wouldn't last a month. He made the bet loudly, of course, with that polished, predatory smile that made the younger nurses giggle and the older ones look away. Sarah Miller, for her part, seemed oblivious. Or perhaps, after a lifetime of far worse things, she had simply perfected the art of not hearing. She moved with a deliberate, plotting pace that drove the frantic, caffeine-fueled residents to the brink of madness. Her graying hair was pulled back into a severe, unfashionable bun that seemed to belong in a library, not a Level 1 trauma center in downtown Chicago. Her oversized scrubs, always a size too big, hung on a small frame that looked as if a strong gust of wind off Lake Michigan could knock it over. She looked, as Dr. Sterling was fond of saying, like a librarian who had taken a very, very wrong turn. She checked charts with an obsessive slowness, her finger tracing each line of medication, each recorded vital, as if deciphering ancient scripture. Her hands, those damnable hands, were the primary source of mockery. The tremor was barely perceptible, a fine, high-frequency vibration you could only see if you were looking for it. And everyone, following Dr. Sterling's lead, was always looking for it. "Grandma Dusty, could you re-verify the saline lock on bed 4? Sterling's voice boomed across the nurse's station one particularly grueling Friday night. He didn't look at her, too busy smoothing the lapel of his pristine white coat, a garment he wore like a suit of armor. "We can't have our patients developing air embolisms because someone's hands are shaking too much to flush a line properly." A few of the younger nurses, like Brittany Moore, a new graduate who orbited Sterling like a nervous moon, let out a stifled laugh. Sarah didn't look up from the chart she was reviewing. Her voice, when it came, was raspy and low, the product of years spent shouting over the roar of things far louder than hospital monitors. "I flushed and locked it 12 minutes ago, doctor. It's secure." "Humor me," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension. He finally turned to look at her, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. He made a show of checking the Rolex on his wrist, a platinum beacon of his family's wealth. His father was a senator, a fact he never failed to mention, and the Sterling name was plastered on the side of the hospital's newest cardiac wing. "Protocol is protocol, and my protocol says when a nurse seems uncertain, we double-check, just to be safe." The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Uncertain. Shaky. Old. Brenda Harrison, the charge nurse, a woman in her 50s with arms like a dock worker and a face that had seen the worst of Chicago for 3 decades, slammed a chart down on the counter. The sound made Brittany jump. "Preston, her chart is in order. Leave her be. We've got an MVC coming in hot." Sterling's smile tightened. He loathed it when Brenda used his first name. It was a small act of defiance she clung to. "Of course, Brenda. Just ensuring the highest standards of patient care." He gave Sarah one last dismissive glance. "Don't want any accidents." Sarah Miller rose from her chair. The joints in her bad knee popped with an audible crack, a legacy of an old injury she never discussed. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward bed 4. She didn't look at Sterling. She didn't look at the smirking residents. She just moved with that same infuriatingly steady pace, her focus entirely on the patient. She checked the lock, her trembling fingers surprisingly deft as they traced the line, and then she initialed the chart. Done. She returned to the nurse's station, her face an unreadable mask of professionalism. She'd been at Metropolitan for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of this. 3 weeks of being treated like a fragile relic, a charity case the hospital had been forced to take on. She needed this job. The pension was all that stood between her and a future of greeting customers at a big box store. After a life spent in chaos, all she had wanted was peace. A quiet, anonymous life where she could still help people, but without the gunfire, without the screaming, without the blood-soaked sand. She had thought a civilian hospital would be that peace. She was wrong. The battlefield here was different, fought with whispers and condescending smiles, and the slow, grinding erosion of a person's dignity. And its commanding officer was Dr. Preston Sterling. Sterling leaned against the counter, winking at Brittany, who blushed. "See, a little oversight is all it takes. Keeps everyone on their toes." He was speaking loudly, a performance for the entire floor. "Especially those who are a bit past their prime. It's a liability issue, really." Sarah's hands, resting on her lap beneath the counter, clenched into fists. The tremor, for a moment, stopped. She focused on the hum of the fluorescent lights, the distant wail of an approaching siren, the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee. She breathed in, a slow, controlled breath she had learned in a place where a single, uncontrolled exhale could give away your position. She breathed out. The fists unclenched. The tremor returned. She was just Sarah Miller, an old nurse with shaky hands. That's all they needed to see. That's all she would let them see. It was safer that way. Big Mike Sullivan, the night shift security guard who had the gentle mass of a retired offensive lineman, ambled by with a fresh pot of coffee. He was a man of few words, but saw everything. He paused by Sarah's station, pouring her a cup without asking. "Don't let him get to you, Sarah," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Guy's an empty suit, all polish, no substance." She gave him a small, tired smile. "Just doing my job, Mike." "I know," he said, his eyes kind. "You do it better than most." He looked over at Sterling, who was now regaling the residents with a story about his family's yacht. Big Mike shook his head slightly and moved on. The small kindness was a pinprick of light in the suffocating darkness of her shift. She wrapped her trembling hands around the warm mug, the ceramic a small anchor in the storm of her thoughts. Maybe she couldn't last a month. Maybe Sterling would win his $100. The thought settled in her stomach like a cold, heavy stone. It was the thought of her late husband's face, the disappointment she imagined there, that hurt the most. He had made her promise to leave the service, to find a quiet life, to finally be safe. She was trying. God, she was trying. Quick pause. If this story is making your blood boil at the injustice Sarah faced, show your support by hitting the like button below. Trust me, the karma that's coming for Dr. Sterling is absolutely worth waiting for. Now, let's continue. The next few hours passed in a blur of routine misery. Sterling assigned Sarah the demeaning task of restocking the supply closets, a job usually reserved for junior aides. He'd lost confidence in her ability to handle patient-facing duties for the remainder of the shift, he announced to Brenda, who looked ready to chew through the steel counter. Sarah simply nodded and went about her work. She organized saline bags, she counted suture kits, she checked the expiration dates on boxes of sterile gloves, her supposedly shaky hands moving with an efficiency that belied the insult. She was in the back of a supply closet, stacking boxes of gauze when the world changed. The alarm didn't just ring, it screamed, a sound few on the floor had ever heard before. It wasn't a code blue for cardiac arrest or a code red for fire. It was a flat, terrifyingly urgent klaxon that cut through the hospital's normal cacophony. Code black, all personnel, Trauma Bay 1, ETA 2 minutes, military escort, this is not a drill, repeat, this is not a drill. The atmosphere in the emergency department shifted instantly from controlled chaos to something primal. Code Black was a designation for a mass casualty event or a high-level security threat, often involving military or federal personnel. It meant lockdown. It meant all hands. It meant the rule book was about to be set on fire. Sarah emerged from the supply closet. The nurses' station was a hive of activity. Residents who had been lounging were now scrambling for gloves. Brenda was on the phone, her voice sharp and commanding, coordinating with the blood bank. And in the middle of it all stood Dr. Preston Sterling, looking for the first time not like a god, but like a man in over his head. His face was pale. He was straightening his tie, a nervous, reflexive gesture. "All right, people, settle down," he barked, his voice a half octave too high. "Let's show them what Metropolitan can do. I want a full trauma panel, X-ray on standby, and someone get me ortho and neuro down here now." He was projecting confidence, but Sarah saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. He was a surgeon of elegance, a master of the scheduled, sterile environment of the OR. This was different. This was the abyss. The sound came next. A low, rhythmic thrumming that grew rapidly louder, pressing against the windows, vibrating through the floor. It was a sound that bypassed Sarah's ears and went straight to the marrow of her bones. Thwop, thwop, thwop. A Black Hawk helicopter. Not on the rooftop helipad, on the street. The double doors to the ambulance bay burst open, not with a gentle whoosh, but with a violent slam. Two paramedics, faces grim, wheeled in a gurney at a dead run. They were flanked by 4 men in tactical gear, their faces hard, their weapons held at a low ready. They weren't police, they were military, MPs. 38-year-old male, multiple GSWs to the upper torso and neck, the paramedic yelled, his voice strained. BP is 80 over palp, heart rate 140 and thready. We've pushed 2 units of O-neg, he's barely holding on. On the gurney was a man built like a monument, his powerful frame diminished by pain and blood loss. His tactical vest was cut away, revealing a chest slick with blood. A field dressing, soaked through, was pressed against his neck. Sterling lunged forward, his confidence returning now that he had a visible problem to solve. "Get him into Bay 1. Let's get some pressure on that neck bleed. I need suction and a vascular tray, now." The team swarmed the gurney, transferring the patient to the trauma bed. The monitors screamed to life, a symphony of disaster. Sarah stood back, near the wall, her training keeping her out of the way unless called upon. But she wasn't just watching as a nurse, she was assessing. The way the MPs moved, their quiet professionalism, their gear. JSOC. The patient's physique, the remnants of his kit. SEAL, maybe. The wounds were bad, but it was something else that caught her eye. Sterling was obsessed with the neck wound. It was dramatic, pulsing blood with every weak beat of the man's heart. "More lap pads! Someone get a hand in there! I can't see the source!" he yelled. But Sarah's gaze was fixed on the man's throat and upper chest. His neck veins were distended, bulging like thick cords. His trachea, the windpipe she could just barely see above the bloody mess, wasn't in the center of his neck. It was shifted, pushed almost 3 centimeters to the left. His chest was rising with the bag valve mask, but only on one side. The other side was still, eerily motionless. Her blood ran cold. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung from one of the gunshot wounds was leaking air into his chest cavity, building up pressure, crushing his heart and his good lung. The neck bleed would kill him in minutes. The air pressure in his chest would kill him in seconds. "Doctor," Sarah said, her voice quiet but clear. It was lost in the noise.
"I need a clamp!" Sterling shouted, his hands slippery with blood.
"Damn it, where is vascular?" The patient's oxygen saturation, displayed in angry red numbers on the monitor, began to plummet. 85, 80, 75. His lips, visible under the oxygen mask, were turning a dusky violet. "Dr. Sterling!" Sarah said, louder this time, taking a step forward. He whirled on her, his face a mask of fury and stress. "What? Can't you see I'm busy saving this man's life?" Go restock something, Grandma. The insult, so casual and cruel just an hour ago, now felt like a gunshot itself. His trachea is deviated, she said, her voice flat and cold. He has no breath sounds on the right. It's a tension pneumo. Sterling stared at her as if she'd sprouted a second head. It's a massive hemorrhage. The pressure drop is from blood loss. Now get out of my way! The monitor shrieked a new, more desperate alarm. The patient's heart rate was cratering. Bradycardia. 50. 45. 40. He was dying. Right now. In front of them. Sterling was frozen, staring at the geyser of blood from the neck, completely missing the invisible killer inside the man's chest. In that moment, something inside Sarah Miller broke. Or perhaps it was reforged. The quiet, submissive nurse evaporated, burned away by a sudden cold fire. In her place stood someone else. Someone older, harder, and far, far more dangerous. The 20 years of dirt and blood and saving boys who looked just like this one in places that God had forgotten rose up in her. The promise to her husband, the need for a pension, the fear of losing her job, it all turned to dust. All that mattered was the dying soldier on the table. She didn't ask for permission. She moved. It wasn't the slow, shuffling walk of Sarah Miller, the old nurse. It was the explosive, efficient movement of Lieutenant Colonel Miller, call sign Dusty, of the Army Medical Corps, attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment. She didn't run. She flowed. She bypassed the scrub cart, her hand shooting out and snatching a 14-gauge angiocath from an open tray. Sterling saw the movement out of the corner of his eye. "Nurse, I said get back! Security!" She didn't slow. As she reached the bed, Sterling put a hand out to shove her. "I will have your license for this." Sarah didn't even look at him. She dipped her shoulder, a subtle, practiced movement. It wasn't a push. It was a tactical block, using his own momentum against him. Her elbow, reinforced by decades of lean, hard muscle, connected solidly with his sternum. The air went out of him with a startled oof, and he stumbled back, tripping over a discarded saline bag and landing hard on the floor. The room went deathly silent. The only sound was the dying wail of the monitor. Every eye was on Sarah. The MPs, who had been a wall of tense stillness, shifted their weight, their eyes wide with shock and something else. Recognition of a certain kind of movement. Sarah ignored them all. Her world had narrowed to the patient on the table. She ripped open the man's tactical shirt further, exposing his right side. Her left hand, the one that trembled, flattened against his chest, her fingers finding the landmarks with unerring accuracy. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. It was a motion she had performed 1,000 times in the back of bucking helicopters, in dusty alleyways with bullets snapping overhead. Her shaky right hand, holding the long needle, was now as steady as a rock. The tremor was gone, banished by the ice-cold certainty of her purpose. "What is she doing?" a resident, David Cole, whispered in horror. "She's going to puncture his lung." "His lung is already punctured, you idiot," Brenda Harrison rasped, her eyes glued to Sarah. Sarah didn't hesitate. She drove the needle in, through the skin, the muscle, between the ribs. There was a pop as it breached the pleural cavity. And then, a sound audible throughout the silent room. Hiss. It was the sound of air, trapped and under immense pressure, escaping the chest cavity. It was the sound of a bomb being diffused. The effect was immediate and miraculous. On the monitor, the oxygen saturation numbers, which had been in the low 60s, began to climb. 70, 75, 85, 92, 98. The patient's chest, which had been rising only on one side, now rose symmetrically with each squeeze of the bag. The horrific distension in his neck veins subsided. The purple in his lips faded to a healthy pink. His heart rate, which had been on the verge of stopping, picked up. 60. 80. 95. A steady, life-affirming rhythm. The man on the table took a deep, shuddering gasp, his own breath for the first time since he'd arrived. Sarah pulled the needle out, leaving the flexible catheter in place, and taped it down. She had not spoken a single word. She stepped back from the table, her job done. The adrenaline began to recede, and she felt her knees go weak. She leaned against a supply cart, her chest heaving. The tremor returned to her hands, this time more pronounced, a reaction to the adrenaline dump. The room remained frozen for a long second, suspended in disbelief. Dr. Preston Sterling, still on the floor, stared up at her, his mouth agape, his arrogant face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked from her to the now stable patient, to the monitors displaying normal vital signs. The logic simply did not compute. The old, incompetent nurse, the librarian, had just performed a flawless, life-saving procedure that he, the chief of surgery, had completely missed. And she had assaulted him to do it. Then the patient moved. His eyes, which had been rolled back in his head, fluttered open. They were hazy with pain and drugs, but they were searching. They scanned past the stunned faces of the residents, past the blinking lights, past Sterling on the floor. They found Sarah, leaning against the cart, looking small and exhausted. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. His hand, shaking with effort, lifted from the gurney. It was a weak, trembling gesture, but its intent was unmistakable. He brought his fingers to his brow in a slow, formal salute. And then he spoke, his voice a raw, broken whisper through the oxygen mask. But every single person in that silent room heard it. "Dusty. Thank you, ma'am." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Dusty. Ma'am. The salute. These were not words spoken to a nurse. This was the language of a different world, a world of rigid hierarchy and earned respect. One of the MPs, the one who looked like the team leader, let out a slow breath he seemed to have been holding since they arrived. He looked at Sarah, and for the first time, his hard face softened with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. "Holy hell," he breathed. "You're the Dusty." Sterling, scrambling to his feet, his face turning from white to a blotchy, furious red, finally found his voice. "What? What the hell just happened? She assaulted me. That woman is unstable. She needs to be arrested." But no one was listening to him. They were all staring at the small, grey-haired woman with the shaky hands, who had just been addressed with the reverence a soldier reserves for a legend. Incredible, right? If you want to see more stories where the underdog becomes the hero, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell. Also, comment below with your best guess about what happens to Dr. Sterling, because trust me, his downfall is going to be spectacular. Let's continue. The spell broke. The trauma team, jolted back to life by the patient's stability, resumed their work. But the dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. The other surgeons, who had just arrived, took over managing the now controlled neck bleed, their movements deferential, their voices hushed. They kept glancing at Sarah as if she might suddenly transform into something else entirely. Sterling, however, was consumed by a tidal wave of humiliation and rage. His authority had been shattered in front of his entire department. He pointed a trembling finger at Sarah. You are finished. You assaulted a physician. You performed an unauthorized procedure. I'm calling security. I'm calling the police." Brenda Harrison stepped between them, a solid, immovable object. "You'll do no such thing, Preston. You were frozen, and she saved your patient's life. A patient you were about to kill. I saw it. We all saw it. Brittany Moore, the young nurse who had laughed at Sterling's jokes, stood pale and silent, her hand over her mouth. Her eyes, wide with horror and a dawning respect, were fixed on Sarah.
"She got lucky!" Sterling shrieked, his voice cracking. "It was a reckless gamble. I was managing the primary bleed. That is protocol."
Sarah simply peeled off her bloody gloves and dropped them in a biohazard bin. She turned to Brenda, her voice once again quiet and tired. "He's stable. I'm going to go finish the supply closet." She turned and walked away, her pace once again slow and measured, the pop of her knee echoing in the now bustling room. She left behind a scene of utter bewilderment and a chief of surgery whose reputation was bleeding out on the floor. It took less than an hour. Sterling, having patched up his bruised ego and even more bruised sternum, went straight to the top. He stormed into the office of Harold Henderson, the hospital administrator, a man whose spine was made of gelatin and whose primary concern was liability. Sarah was paged to the administrative conference room. She knew what was coming. She walked the long, silent corridor, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. The room was all dark mahogany and plush leather, designed to intimidate. Henderson sat at the head of the table, sweating profusely and wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. Two people from Human Resources were there, their faces impassive. And at the far end, looking smug and vindicated, sat Dr. Preston Sterling, his white coat immaculate once more. "Sarah," Henderson began, his voice slick with false sympathy. "We have a very serious situation here. Dr. Sterling has filed a formal complaint. Assault, insubordination, performing a medical procedure far outside the scope of your nursing duties. The list is quite extensive." Sarah stood before them, her hands clasped behind her back to hide the tremor. She said nothing. The HR director, a woman with cold eyes, read from a file. "The charge is gross misconduct. According to Dr. Sterling, you physically attacked him and then performed a dangerous, unsanctioned intervention that could have killed the patient." Sterling leaned forward. "I had the situation under control. She panicked. She's clearly mentally unstable, a danger to patients and staff. I demand her immediate termination and that the state board be notified to review her license." Sarah finally spoke, her voice a low rasp. "The patient is stable, isn't he?" Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, the patient is stable, but your methods were unorthodox and violent. We have a zero-tolerance policy for workplace violence, Sarah, especially against a department head." This was it. The end of the line. 2 decades of saving lives, from the mountains of the Hindu Kush to the dusty streets of Fallujah, and it was all going to end in a sterile conference room in Chicago because she had bruised a senator's son's ego. A bitter, ironic laugh threatened to bubble up from her chest, but she swallowed it down. "Fine," she said, the single word hanging in the air. She didn't beg, she didn't argue, she just accepted it. A lifetime of following orders, and the one time she broke a rule to save a life, this was the price. "If saving a life costs me my career," she added, looking directly at Sterling, whose smile faltered for a second, "I'll pay that price every time." Henderson pulled a pre-written letter from a folder. The efficiency of it was sickening. "Effective immediately, your employment at Metropolitan Trauma Center is terminated. Security will escort you from the premises." Big Mike was waiting outside the conference room. The look on his face was one of profound sadness and anger. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said as they walked toward the nurse's station for her to collect her things. "This isn't right." "Just the way it is, Mike," she said, her voice hollow. The walk through the ER was a gauntlet of averted eyes. The same residents and nurses who had been staring at her with awe an hour ago now couldn't meet her gaze. They knew. They knew it was unjust, but they also knew that Sterling's power was absolute, and they had their own careers to protect. Only Brenda Harrison met her eye, giving her a single, sharp nod of respect that spoke volumes. Sarah packed her few belongings into a small cardboard box. A cracked coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Nurse," a well-worn stethoscope she'd bought herself, a dying succulent plant from her small apartment's windowsill, and a small, framed photo of her late husband in his dress uniform. 2 decades of a life, reduced to a box that wouldn't even fill the passenger seat of a car. Big Mike walked her to the main entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing a city weeping a cold, miserable October rain. "You take care of yourself, you hear?" he said, his voice thick. "Watch that blood pressure, Mike," she replied, managing a weak smile. The doors slid shut behind her, and she was alone. The rain was coming down in sheets, plastering her thin hair to her scalp and soaking through her scrubs in seconds. Her car was in the shop, an expense she couldn't really afford, so she started the long 6-block walk to the bus stop. Each step was heavy, laden with the weight of defeat. The cardboard box grew soggy in her arms, and she clutched it to her chest, trying to shield the photo of her husband from the downpour. Her bad knee throbbed in a painful rhythm with each step. The cold seeped into her bones. It was over. It wasn't an angry thought, just a heavy, suffocating fact. She was 53 years old, fired, with a black mark on her record that would follow her everywhere. She'd end up as a greeter at a grocery store, another forgotten old woman with a story no one would ever know. She finally reached the bus stop, a flimsy shelter of plexiglass that did little to ward off the wind and rain. She huddled in the corner, shivering, the soggy box a pathetic symbol of her failed attempt at a quiet life. She looked at her reflection in the rain-streaked glass, a tired, wet old woman. Grandma Dusty. Maybe they were right all along. That's when the world started to shake. It began as a low thrum, a vibration felt more in her teeth than heard with her ears. The puddles on the street rippled. The plexiglass of the bus shelter rattled in its frame. The sound grew, a deep, guttural roar that drowned out the city traffic and the drumming of the rain. Thwop, 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 thwop. It was the sound of rotors, not one helicopter this time, but 3. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the rain. Through the low grey clouds, 2 Apache attack helicopters materialized, circling like birds of prey, and below them, descending with impossible precision into the middle of the wide 6-lane intersection a block away, was a Black Hawk. It didn't land on a building. It landed on the goddamn street, its downdraft a hurricane of wind and water that inverted umbrellas and sent trash cans rolling. Cars slammed on their brakes, a chain reaction of screeching tires and crunching metal. People on the street scattered, screaming, assuming it was a terrorist attack. From the side streets, black SUVs with government plates came screeching to a halt, boxing in the intersection. Men in dark suits and earpieces emerged, sweeping the area with a cold, professional gaze. Sarah stared, bewildered. What in God's name was happening? Then, the ramp of the Black Hawk lowered. Out walked a figure, tall and ramrod straight, flanked by 2 soldiers in dress blues. He held a cane, but he didn't lean on it. He wielded it like a scepter. Even from a block away, in the pouring rain, she could see the 4 silver stars gleaming on each of his shoulders. A 4-star general. The general surveyed the scene, his eyes scanning the chaos with an air of supreme command. He said something to one of his aides, who pointed. He pointed directly at the bus stop. Directly at her. A black SUV detached from the blockade and sped toward her, its tires sending up huge plumes of water. It screeched to a halt at the curb. A man in a suit jumped out, holding an umbrella, but he was already soaked. He was followed by a soldier, a young army ranger who moved with a fluid, lethal grace. The soldier sprinted toward her, dodging traffic, his eyes locked on her. He didn't slow down until he was right in front of her. He was panting, his face a mixture of urgency and disbelief. "Ma'am?" he said, his voice respectful. "Lieutenant Colonel Miller?" Sarah's heart stopped. No one had called her that in 5 years.
"You need to come with us," the soldier said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Now." I don't understand," she stammered, clutching her soggy box. "Drop the box, ma'am. We have to go." He reached for her arm. "No," she said, a flicker of her old stubbornness returning. "The box comes with me." The soldier didn't argue. He simply nodded, took the box from her with surprising gentleness, and guided her toward the waiting SUV. As they hustled her into the warm, dry interior, the general began walking from the intersection toward the hospital entrance, the crowd of onlookers parting before him like the Red Sea. He walked through the downpour, as if it didn't dare touch him. "What is going on?" Sarah asked the man in the suit, as the SUV sped back toward the hospital. The man gave her a grim smile. "The cavalry, ma'am," he said. "The cavalry has arrived." The SUV pulled up to the main entrance, right behind the general's entourage. The lobby of Metropolitan Trauma Center was in chaos. Reporters, drawn by the spectacle outside, were swarming the entrance, their cameras flashing. Hospital staff were crowded by the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. And in the center of the lobby, standing at a hastily assembled podium, was Dr. Preston Sterling. He was giving a press conference. "A difficult procedure, but thanks to the quick thinking and decisive action of my team, the patient was stabilized," he was saying, his voice smooth and confident. "He is a true American hero, and he received the absolute best care this hospital has to offer. I, personally, saw to it." The general walked through the automatic doors, his cane tapping a sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack on the polished marble floor. The entire lobby fell silent. The reporters turned their cameras from Sterling to the 4-star general who had just entered their midst. Sterling's confident smile faltered. He stared, utterly dumbfounded, as the most powerful man in the United States military walked directly toward him. "General Vance," Sterling stammered, recognizing the face from the news. "What an honor! To what do we owe the pleasure?" General Thomas Vance stopped a few feet from the podium. His eyes were chips of ice. "I was watching your press conference on my way over, Doctor. It was illuminating." At that moment, Sarah was escorted into the lobby. She stood near the entrance, dripping water onto the floor, clutching her pathetic box. A few staff members noticed her and gasped. General Vance's gaze flickered to her for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement, before returning to Sterling. "You just told the nation that you saved that man's life," the general said, his voice dangerously quiet. Yes, my team and I," Sterling began, his bravado rapidly evaporating under the general's cold stare. "That man is Commander Jacob Deacon Trent," Vance said, his voice rising slightly, carrying across the silent lobby. "He's a decorated Navy SEAL, the leader of SEAL Team 4. He is also my godson." A collective gasp went through the room. Sterling's face drained of all color. "You told me personally on the phone not 30 minutes ago," the general continued, his voice like grinding stone, "that he was in the best hands. You lied. You also told me that a nurse, a Sarah Miller, had been fired for gross incompetence and for assaulting you." "She was unstable. She endangered him," Sterling insisted, his voice high and reedy. "Is that her?" Vance asked, pointing his cane directly at Sarah. Sterling's head whipped around.
He saw her, small and wet and clutching her box. A triumphant, vicious sneer crossed his face. "Yes, that's her! Security, remove this woman! She's been terminated!" No one moved. Big Mike, standing near the security desk, simply crossed his massive arms over his chest. General Vance took a slow step forward. "I have reviewed the unedited security footage from Trauma Bay 1. I have seen the telemetry data. I have spoken to my godson, who, despite being heavily sedated, was lucid enough to say 2 words. Dusty saved me." The general turned to the assembled press, his voice now a booming command. "You want a story? Here's your story." He turned back to Sterling. An aide stepped forward and handed the general a black folder with the Department of Defense seal stamped on it. Vance opened it. "Do you know who Sarah Miller is, Doctor?" he asked, the question rhetorical and dripping with contempt. He didn't look at the file as he spoke. He knew it by heart. "She is retired Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller of the United States Army Medical Corps. She served 3 tours in Iraq and 4 in Afghanistan. For 10 of those years, she was the lead trauma specialist attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment, a unit that operates under the Joint Special Operations Command." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. The reporters were scribbling furiously. The hospital staff was staring at Sarah as if she had just grown wings. Brittany Moore had both hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "She is the recipient of the Bronze Star with Valor," the general continued, his voice ringing with pride. "A Purple Heart and the Silver Star, our nation's 3rd highest award for gallantry in action, which she received for holding manual pressure on a severed femoral artery of a wounded ranger for 6 hours in a disabled vehicle under enemy fire, refusing evacuation for herself until every one of her men was safe." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He looked at Sarah's hands, still clutching the box. "Those shaky hands you mocked? That's permanent nerve damage from that day. The bad knee you made fun of? Shrapnel from an IED blast in Kandahar, sustained while she was shielding a wounded soldier with her own body. She is a legend. In the special operations community, she is known by one name: Dusty. They call her that because she's the one you want when everything has turned to dust. Because she will walk through hell itself to bring you back." The room was utterly silent, save for the frantic clicking of cameras. The general took another step toward Sterling, his face a mask of cold fury. "A first-year combat medic in a muddy ditch would have spotted that tension pneumothorax. You, the chief of surgery at this prestigious hospital, missed it. You were going to let my godson die while you preened for your staff. And when this woman, this hero, tried to save him, you assaulted her. The footage is quite clear. You pushed her first." Sterling began to crumble. Sweat poured down his face, his pristine white coat suddenly looking like a cheap costume. My father, Senator Sterling," he stammered, reaching for his last lifeline. "I just got off the phone with your father," General Vance said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "He sends his deepest apologies. And his resignation from the hospital board, effective immediately." It was a death blow. The last pillar of Sterling's world had just been kicked out from under him. He staggered back, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. The general turned to Harold Henderson, who was trying to shrink into the expensive mahogany paneling behind him. "Mr. Henderson, as of this moment, the Department of Defense is launching a full investigation into this hospital's practices, starting with a decade's worth of billing fraud we've been tracking that seems to lead right back to Dr. Sterling's department. I expect your full cooperation." He then looked at Sarah. "And Lieutenant Colonel Miller is to be reinstated, effective immediately, with back pay and a promotion. I'm thinking Director of Trauma Training and Protocol for the entire hospital network. You will create the position. Is that understood? Henderson nodded frantically, wiping his brow. Yes, General. Of course, General. Anything. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and then, in a move of spectacular self-preservation, turned on Sterling. Dr. Sterling, effective immediately, your privileges are suspended. Your employment is terminated pending the results of the federal investigation. Please gather your personal effects. Sterling stood there, broken. The arrogant prince had been dethroned, his kingdom shattered around him. Then, the final, perfect act of karmic justice occurred. Big Mike Sullivan stepped forward. In his hands, he held an empty cardboard box. He walked past the reporters, past the stunned staff, and stopped directly in front of the disgraced doctor. He held out the box. His face was grim, but his eyes held a glint of profound satisfaction. I believe you know the way out, Doctor, he said, his voice rumbling through the silent lobby. Sterling stared at the box as if it were a venomous snake. He was forced to take it, his hands now shaking far more than Sarah's ever had. He stumbled away from the podium, away from the cameras, a pariah in the kingdom he once ruled, to pack up the remnants of his shattered career. General Vance walked over to Sarah. He gently took the soggy box from her hands and gave it to an aide. You're a hard woman to track down, Dusty, he said, his voice now soft and full of warmth. Sarah looked up at the powerful man, a true friend from a life she thought she'd left behind, and for the first time in a very long time, she smiled. A real smile. You know me, Tom, she said, her raspy voice barely a whisper. I was just trying to live a quiet life. Well, he said, a twinkle in his eye, you failed spectacularly at that. He offered her his arm. Come on, Colonel, let's go get you a dry uniform. You have a hospital to fix. 1 year later, the sun shone brightly on the newly christened Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller Center for Trauma and Emergency Medicine. The dedication ceremony was packed. In the front row sat General Thomas Vance, beaming with pride. Beside him sat a healthy, smiling Commander Jacob Deacon Trent, a faint scar on his neck, the only reminder of that rainy October night. The hospital staff stood tall, their faces full of a respect that had been earned, not demanded. The toxic culture of fear had been dismantled, piece by piece, by Sarah's quiet, unshakable leadership. Mortality rates in the trauma unit had dropped by 15% since her protocols. A blend of military field medicine and civilian best practices had been implemented. Sarah, now the Director of Patient Care and Safety, stood at the podium. She wore crisp, tailored scrubs and a lab coat that actually fit, but her hair was still in that same simple bun. She kept her speech short. A hospital shouldn't be a hierarchy, she said, her voice stronger now, clearer. It should be a team. The person with the mop is just as important as the person with the scalpel, because a slip on a wet floor can be as deadly as a slip of the knife. Authority isn't a title on a door. It's earned in the trust of your patients and your colleagues. She looked out at the crowd, her eyes finding a young, nervous-looking nurse in the back, a new graduate who reminded her so much of Brittany Moore, who was now one of her best and most outspoken charge nurses. This center isn't named after me because I'm special, she concluded. It's named after a nurse. It's a promise that in this hospital we will always put the patient first. And if you have to break a rule to save a life, you break the rule. I'll have your back. A thunderous applause erupted. As she stepped away from the podium, the young nurse from the back approached her hesitantly. Ma'am? Colonel Miller? That was incredible. I'm so nervous about starting. What if I mess up? Sarah looked at the young woman, seeing the same fear and uncertainty she had once felt. She placed a hand on her shoulder.
The tremor was still there, a constant companion, a physical reminder of the lives she had held in her hands. "Just protect your patients," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "Listen to them. Listen to your gut, and don't ever let anyone make you feel small for doing the right thing." She gave the young nurse's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "The rest will take care of itself, I promise." As Sarah walked away, she saw a delivery truck outside the hospital. The man driving it looked vaguely familiar. He was older, his face puffy, his movements slow. He wore a stained company polo and a hairnet. It was Preston Sterling. His medical license had been permanently revoked. His family, embroiled in the federal fraud investigation, had cut him off. He was now managing a regional medical supply distribution franchise in Ohio, a fate his father's remaining influence had secured to keep him out of prison. He was checking expiration dates on a pallet of IV bags, his hands shaking. He looked up, and his eyes met Sarah's for a fleeting second. A flicker of pure, undiluted fear crossed his face before he quickly looked away, forever glancing over his shoulder, a ghost haunted by the legend he had tried and failed to destroy. Sarah felt nothing, not pity, not anger, not satisfaction, just a quiet finality. He was no longer a part of her world. She had a hospital to run. And that is the incredible true story of Sarah Dusty Miller. It's crazy to think that she was fired for saving a life just minutes before a 4-star general needed her to do exactly that. It really makes you wonder how many heroes are out there right now, getting punished for doing the right thing just because it breaks a protocol. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more real-life dramas about heroes getting the justice they deserve, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below telling me what you think should have happened to Dr. Preston Sterling. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.